Nerd Night, thinking about architecture.
All right, so we're going to talk about architecture supervillains, and I will start by telling you a little bit why. I grew up in a suburb of Atlanta called Stone Mountain. It has the honor of being the largest outcropping of granite on the planet. Yep, that's where I grew up. Not a whole lot to say about it other than that. But after that, I decided to move to Ann Arbor. I did that about 9 years ago to study architecture here, and I felt so at home about 10 minutes after I pulled up that I decided to stay. So 9 years later, I'm still here. I studied architecture, I left, I went to work for a firm, not designing, but in communications. It turns out that I do really just like to talk about buildings and cities. So that's what I do for a living. Right now I'm a marketing consultant for architects and builders. So for my work, I talk about buildings and cities. For fun, I talk about buildings and cities here and in Ann Arbor, YIMBY, and pretty much anytime will sit down and talk with me for a minute. And one of the things that I found really interesting in these conversations is, Chrissy, I love that, trigger words. People definitely have trigger words with respect to the built environment. And I think this is really curious and interesting. I am a huge fan of buildings, especially when they're done well. I feel like buildings make really good and interesting neighbors, but it's complicated to get there. And I'm very curious about the process that it takes to get our buildings to be good neighbors, which requires a lot of conversation. It requires a lot of community collaboration and much longer than it feels like it should. But that's what good communities take, is really all of us kind of contributing to it. And in these conversations, people get super fraught about some words. So I've been thinking for a while about what some of these words are, and I am using this evening to unpack them with you. The first one is developers. The second one is big buildings. And the third one is politicians. So developers. Yes, developers. And I'm not a parent, but many of them are my friends, and I hear you guys say all the time, use your words. So we're gonna use our words and unpack what it is that we don't like about developers. We hate that they're vultures. They take things out of our community and leave it worse than it was before. And worst of all, they're outsiders. This is a Google image of some guy named Todd. Fucking Todd, man. All right, they're vultures because they make crazy amounts of money on these projects, and we hate that. And not only that, but they take the money outside of our communities, which is not fair. We had it first. And Todd's making off with it because he doesn't even live here. Jerk Todd, fucking Todd, man. But I think that there's a way that we can think about this maybe a little bit more positively, or at least with a little bit more complexity and nuance. So let's unpack those terms maybe a little bit more. So vultures, they make a ton of money, but let's understand that a little bit more. Development is one of the highest risk careers that you can go into. I read a statistic, I don't know what the bench lines are, and I'm not gonna tell you what my source is because I don't remember, but the statistics that I read, a statistic that I read said that 95% of developers fail before they even get a building out of the ground. Once you are successful with that, most developments still don't come out of the ground. So you're investing years of time and a lot of money in projects that may or may not actually come off. So what we see are people winning the lottery, but that lottery has to sustain them and their families and their teams for a long time. So I'm not saying that it's not a lot of money, but I'm saying let's maybe add a little bit more nuance to how we're thinking about that amount of money. If we had to take a 3-year paycheck once every 3 years, that would look like a lot of money too. So what else don't we like? We don't like that it's extractive. It really feels like a lot of developments and buildings take away from our communities rather than add to them. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. One example that I really love is the Chicago Riverwalk. So if you're familiar with the city, the buildings are beautiful, even the balustrades and the sidewalk are lovely. But before they did anything with this space, it was really just kind of a garbage barge. And the only people people who enjoyed the murky water were folks who were walking along the sidewalk. The Riverwalk really has transformed the city's relationship to their primary water feature. Has anybody here, by the way, taken the Chicago architecture tour? Is that not the coolest, right? So the Riverwalk has turned from kind of an eyesore that was only available to some people to a true community amenity. There's eating, there's drinking. You can sit right by the water. In fact, that's a slip. Boats can pull right up to it. You can dangle your feet in there if you like. You can't see it here, but there's a very active cycling trail. So there are cyclists and joggers and strollers and skateboarders going along there all the time. It's very ADA accessible, and it's really become a true community space. So thoughtfully done. Developments don't have to take away from our community. They can truly enrich it. And then the last one, outsiders. Fucking Todd. So I'd like to kind of bring that into context with everything else that we consume. Our food, our clothes, the building materials for the buildings, the building materials for the homes that we live in and the places that we work. Almost all of this is sourced outside of our community. And Ann Arbor is relatively unique in their emphasis and also ability to go local. But just to be fair, it's tough to do that. This is a high-risk venture. It's a very challenging profession. As with many challenging professions, they tend to be concentrated in specific areas, and places like this aren't one. But we do have the option to go local with developers. You may have seen signs for First Martin around town, for Peter Allen developers who really focus on North Main. I also want to encourage us to kind of broaden how we think about developers from Todd to all of us. If you've done work on your home, if you are a business owner and own or lease a space in a building, if you've hung a poster on a wall, you have done something to improve a space that you live in. Development doesn't have to be a multi-million-dollar, multi-year venture. It can be any one of us all the time, just improving the spaces that we're living in. So, not just Todd, all of us. All right. So, no, we're not Todd. Todd is us. So what else do we hate? We hate big buildings. What do we hate about them? We hate that they're big. We hate that they're boring. And they're confusing, kind of. They're massive. This one takes up an entire city block. That's a car. They block out sunlight. They turn our city streets into windy canyons. This one doesn't even have windows. The whole rest of the building just looks exactly like this. And while this may be a pleasing addition to the skyline, this is really challenging to negotiate this building as a human being. It's hard to get in. It's hard to get out. It's hard to find anything. Like, you can drive in, and then after that, you're really on your own. All right, so let's use our words. Let's unpack this a little bit and see if there might be some opportunities. I think yes. All right, so instead of massive, maybe we could talk about massing, about the shape and form of a building. What if it were asymmetrical? What if it contributed something interesting to the skyline? What if it were kind of a regular shape but unconventional? Or kind of breaks our brains about what buildings are supposed to be. This is really where the opportunities for small and large buildings shine, is in doing something unexpected. But we have to start talking about the size of it and start talking about the massing of it. So what can we do about boring? Well, one of the things that we can talk about is the materials. Super basic, what is it made out of? I wish we could build everything out of Legos, but until then, maybe we could make buildings out of mountains. We have the technology to build skyscrapers out of wood, and even trees, right? Tree town, tree skyscraper. There are so many opportunities here. All right, so what do we do with the confusing ones? Let's talk a little bit about what the human experience of that could be, right? So the pedestrian experience, you're walking by, can we see something pleasing? Could it be beautiful? Could it be interesting? Could it reconnect us with nature and ground us with where we are. I mean, this is a really great place to be. There are a lot of places that there's not a lot of there. I think Stone Mountain was one of those places. A lot of suburbs, I think, suffer from the same syndrome. They're nowhere places. Ann Arbor is a very placeful community. So something that reconnects us with the earth, with the wind, with water, with sunlight is very helpful. What if it just gave us a place to sit down? Very basic, often overlooked. Okay, so these are more helpful ways to engage buildings. What about the last dirty word? So what don't we like about them? They don't really seem like people. They're hard to read. It's hard to get into the process. And they can seem unreceptive to what you're trying to say. Okay, using our words, what's the opportunity here? All right, so I think it's interesting. Yes, I agree with the booze. I think it's interesting in this country that politician is a dirty word. I don't think it has to be. I'm not going to make that argument with this slide on the screen. But I would like to say that locally we're very lucky that our politicians are fairly accessible and human. The process of engaging development in buildings can seem very challenging, monolithic, impenetrable, hard to understand, hard to get into. And once you figure out the process and start contributing your voice, if what you say isn't adopted, it can feel like nobody's listening, which is really frustrating. So here in Ann Arbor, our elected officials are pretty accessible. A lot of them are young parents or recently retired. One has a puppy. They bike, Benny the puppy. They bike, they go to the doctor. These are human beings. And so I just kind of wanted to humanize our local politicians. So the process being monolithic can seem tricky because what we get are the headlines, City Council approves development. So it feels like City Council has everything to do with it, but in fact, City Council has very little to do with most developments. But what we're looking at is a big team to bring everything into life. So City Council is in itself 11 people, 1 mayor and 10 City Council members, 2 for each ward. And the date for the next election is August 7th. Good job, nerd in the back. We've got a Democratic primary, and I know everybody's voting. All right, so we've got our 11 City Council members. They're contested wards, contested races in each ward, so everybody has something at stake. Supporting City Council is a planning commission, which is a group of 8 to 10 people. Right now, there's a council representative on there, a landscape architect, an actual architect, a realtor, a couple of Ann Arbor people who just like to run around and talk about cities, helping interpret Ann Arbor's zoning code and laws, as well as our values that are expressed in the master plan, like through the sustainability framework and Washtenaw's more recent equity initiative. So helping to interpret all of those documents with respect to site plans and floor plans and elevations, and trying to help understand how buildings fulfill Ann Arbor's stated goals. And supporting them are all of the city staff. So it's not quite this many, but it's a fair amount. So we've got the planning staff, the zoning staff, and the building staff, again, all helping support, write the reports, doing the traffic studies, doing the water studies, making sure that there's not an undue negative impact on our environment, on our city, before a building or a development comes into being. So not only is it a complex team, it's a complex process. And this is where it can start to feel like once you figured out who the players are, once you figured out who to talk to, and you're telling them what you want to see, you figured out, I want to talk about massing, I want to talk about an interesting tree skyscraper, and it's still not happening. It can be because how you're engaging the process. So a building comes into being, as I said, the first thing that we see mostly of a lot of buildings is City Council has approved a development. And that's really the tip of the iceberg. There's been a lot of work that's gone into that. So as I mentioned, the Planning Commission has done work reviewing all of the legal basis, excuse me, and making sure that a given development is available to be recommended to City Council, but they're really just the surface of the water. The meat of the work gets done down here by the developers themselves and by the city staff. And this is really where the largest opportunity for engagement is, although there's an opportunity at every level. You can talk to city council. They have public comment at every city council meeting and for every development, and they're always open for comment. But by the time it gets to city council, it's essentially at the end of the process. So you can talk to the planning commission. They also have public comment for every development and for every meeting. But really what they're doing is legal interpretation. This is where your big payoff is when the building is under development. So when you get those little postcards in the mail, bundled with the credit card offer that you didn't want and the sale from Bed Bath & Beyond, don't throw that one away. Developers are required to inform neighbors within a given radius that a development is coming, and that is your best opportunity to go in and say, how are you bringing value to our community? How are you adding to us instead of extracting to us? What are you bringing to Ann Arbor, to my neighborhood, to the people around me, and to the people who need it with your idea? Really, you, for sure. So I came to talk about architecture supervillains, and I'm still really interested in that, but I think what I really came to talk about was architecture superheroes, and that's really what it's all about. So, thank you very much.
This program was recorded on June 21st, 2018, at Live, 102 South 1st Street, Ann Arbor, Michigan.